Could a free streaming app be hiding movies too bizarre for modern Hollywood to touch? Somewhere between the cheap comedies and forgotten action films, Tubi quietly built a cult movie section filled with banned horror, grotesque practical effects, cursed midnight movies, and low-budget nightmares that feel genuinely unhinged. Some of these films vanished from video stores decades ago. Others became infamous through pure word-of-mouth insanity. And the deeper this list goes, the stranger these movies become. Attack of the 50-Foot Cam Girl, 2022. Some movies don't walk into cult status. They crash through the wall wearing cheap effects and zero shame. Attack of the 50-Foot Cam Girl is exactly the kind of title that makes Tubi feel like a secret back room in an old video store, the shelf nobody was supposed to organize because the chaos was the whole point. On paper, it sounds ridiculous. A modern, low-budget monster comedy built around internet fame, oversized spectacle, and the kind of absurd premise mainstream studios would probably laugh out of the room. But that is also why it belongs here. This is cult cinema in its rawest streaming age form. Fast, strange, knowingly trashy, and completely uninterested in looking respectable. Instead of pretending to be prestige horror or serious science fiction, it leans into the madness of online attention culture, where people become products, scandals become entertainment, and bigger is always better, even when bigger makes no sense. The fun comes from watching a movie that understands exactly what it is. A wild, cheaply made, late-night curiosity built for viewers who want something bizarre enough to tell a friend about. It may not be polished, but cult movies were never about polish. They were about personality, nerve, and the strange pleasure of saying, "I can't believe this actually exists." Scary Tales, Dead Zone, 2023. Tubi has a strange talent for making modern horror feel like it was found in a dusty bargain bin from another dimension. Scary Tales. Dead Zone fits that feeling perfectly because it carries the spirit of old anthology horror. Uneven, weird, low budget, and sometimes more memorable because of its rough edges. This is not the kind of horror that arrives with a giant marketing campaign, glowing critic quotes, or expensive studio confidence. It feels more underground than that, like something passed around between viewers who enjoy discovering the odd corners of horror where creativity often outruns money. Anthology-style fright films have always had a special place in cult culture because they promise variety. One story may be creepy, another may be outrageous, and another may feel like it came from someone's nightmare after too much late-night television. That unpredictability becomes the hook. You are not watching because every moment is perfect. You are watching because you have no idea what strange turn comes next. On a platform like Tubi, that matters. Scary Tales. Dead Zone represents the modern anything-goes side of free streaming horror, where strange little genre experiments can sit beside legends and still find an audience. It is messy, odd, and proudly niche, and that is exactly why cult fans keep digging. Director's Cut, 2016. Here is where Tubi's cult section starts feeling less like a movie library and more like a warning label. Director's Cut is a film built on obsession, fandom, and the uncomfortable line between loving movies and trying to control them. Written by Penn Jillette, the film plays like a twisted meta-joke about a fan who does not just watch cinema, he invades it. That idea alone makes it perfect for a cult list, because cult audiences understand obsession better than anyone. They quote strange movies, defend rejected ones, collect forgotten titles, and sometimes treat odd little films like sacred objects. Director's Cut takes that energy and pushes it into darker, stranger territory. It uses the language of behind-the-scenes commentary, genre parody, and psychological discomfort to create something that feels deliberately unstable. The movie is not trying to be smooth or conventional. It wants the viewer to feel trapped inside the mind of someone who believes his version of the movie is the only one that should exist. That makes it more than just another low-budget thriller. It becomes a bizarre reflection of fan culture itself. Passionate, possessive, funny, creepy, and sometimes frighteningly personal. It is the kind of film that may confuse casual viewers, but for cult audiences, that confusion is part of the attraction. Cthulhu, 2007. A small-town horror movie becomes much stranger when the monster is not just outside the door, but buried inside the town's history. Cthulhu takes inspiration from Lovecraftian dread, but instead of depending only on giant creatures or cosmic spectacle, it builds its unease through isolation, family tension, religious control, and the feeling that an entire community is hiding something rotten beneath the surface. That makes it one of the more unusual titles in this list, because its cult appeal is quieter and more atmospheric than explosive. It is not here because it overwhelms you with gore or nonstop shocks. It is here because it feels off. And sometimes, off is exactly what gives a movie staying power. The film follows a man returning to his hometown, only to find old wounds, strange rituals, and disturbing secrets waiting for him. That familiar return home setup becomes more unsettling as the story slowly suggests that the place itself may be infected by something ancient and inhuman. For viewers expecting traditional creature horror, Cthulhu may feel strange, even frustrating. But for cult fans, that unevenness can become part of its personality. It feels like a flawed transmission from a darker corner of horror cinema, ambitious, moody, and strange enough to stick in the mind after the credits end. Goke, Body Snatcher from Hell, 1968. Imagine a film where the cosmic horror is not just alien but deeply psychological, invading human bodies from within. Goke, Body Snatcher from Hell introduces a chilling scenario where a group of survivors aboard a plane crash encounter an alien force that can possess human bodies. It's not just about a monstrous invader, but the terrifying idea that the people around you may no longer be themselves. The film's surreal atmosphere is what makes it unforgettable, combining existential dread with science fiction and horror in an unsettling blend. The alien's ability to take over human forms creates a creeping paranoia that lingers long after the film ends. Though its special effects are primitive by today's standards, Goke remains disturbingly effective in building tension through its eerie transformations. As an early example of body horror, it questions the nature of identity and possession in ways that mainstream sci-fi never dared. It's a film that stays under the radar but carries a unique narrative that stands in stark contrast to the optimistic space operas of the era, making it an essential but often overlooked piece of cult horror. The War in Space, 1977. What happens when a space opera tries to capture the magic of Star Wars, but with a much smaller budget? The War in Space is Japan's attempt to create an epic space adventure, complete with lasers, interplanetary battles, and an evil empire. The film, released just after the global phenomenon of Star Wars, centers on the battle to save Earth from an alien invasion, but it quickly becomes apparent that it lacks the polish and grandeur of its Hollywood counterpart. The special effects are ambitious for the time, but often look more comical than menacing, with cardboard spaceships and makeshift alien costumes that never quite land. Despite its low-budget shortcomings, The War in Space becomes a fascinating watch due to its eccentricities, offering a nostalgic look at the space operas of the 1970s. The film's wild, kitschy charm lies in its ability to mimic Star Wars without ever reaching its height. The performances are dramatic, the set designs are over the top, and the space battles, though rudimentary, offer moments of thrilling intensity. The War in Space captures that time when filmmakers rushed to cash in on the space craze, but it's a film that holds a special place in sci-fi history for its unapologetic eccentricity and quirky retro-futuristic appeal. For fans of B-movie space adventures, it's a must-see and an unforgettable example of genre ambition gone awry. Who Killed Captain Alex? 2010. Some movies become cult legends because they are expensive. This one became legendary because it refused to wait for permission. Who Killed Captain Alex is one of the wildest examples of pure DIY cinema ever to find a global audience. Made in Uganda by Wakaliwood, the film turned almost no budget into pure action chaos, using homemade effects, improvised energy, and an unstoppable love for martial arts, explosions, gun battles, and absurd comedy. What makes it unforgettable is not polish, it is momentum. The movie moves like someone kicked open the door to an action studio that did not exist yet and decided to build it by hand. The famous Video Joker commentary gives the whole experience a strange, hilarious, interactive feeling, almost like watching an action movie with the loudest friend in the room explaining every punch. On Tubi, it stands out because it reminds viewers that cult cinema is not only about weird horror or banned VHS tapes. Sometimes it is about creative survival. It is about filmmakers using whatever they have, however limited, and still creating something people across the world cannot stop talking about. Who Killed Captain Alex is chaotic, funny, rough, and absolutely fearless. Proof that passion can sometimes hit harder than $100 million budget. Star Crash, 1978. What happens when you try to make a space opera on a shoestring budget? You get something unforgettable, and Star Crash is the perfect example. This bizarre European-Japanese co-production aims to rival the scale and drama of Star Wars, but falls short in the most spectacular way possible, with its colorful costumes, laughably bad special effects, and a storyline that seems to forget what it started with. Star Crash could be written off as a cheap rip-off, but that's where the charm lies. The absurdity of its premise, filled with laser sword battles, strange creatures, and a villain played by Christopher Plummer, elevates it into cult territory. Despite its many flaws, the film refuses to take itself seriously, which adds to its unintentional hilarity. The performances are over the top, the set design's ridiculous, and the entire narrative is unpredictable, making it a perfect example of so bad it's good cinema. Fans of 1970s campy space adventures will appreciate Star Crash for what it is, an utterly absurd ride that embraces its cheesy nature and refuses to apologize for it. Tourist Trap, 1979. Before horror became slick, loud, and carefully branded, Tourist Trap was already turning roadside Americana into a nightmare showroom. This strange late 70s horror film takes one of the creepiest ideas imaginable, mannequins that seem almost alive, and traps its characters inside a dusty attraction where everything feels frozen, staring, and wrong. The result is not just a slasher, not just a supernatural horror film, and not just a bizarre roadside thriller. It is all of those things at once, which is why it still feels so unsettling decades later. Tourist Trap works because it weaponizes silence and stillness. A mannequin does not have to move much to become frightening. It only has to stand there, watching, while the viewer's imagination does the damage. The film's odd atmosphere, eerie setting, and uncanny imagery helped it earn a devoted cult reputation among horror fans who love the uncomfortable space between camp and genuine dread. It feels like something from a forgotten roadside America where every attraction hides a secret room and every smiling figure might be hiding something terrible. On Tubi, it plays like a relic from a more dangerous horror era, strange, dusty, theatrical, and surprisingly effective. Tourist Trap is not polished terror. It is haunted house madness with a frozen plastic grin. Basket Case, 1982. There are low-budget horror movies, and then there is Basket Case, a film so grimy and strange it feels like New York itself coughed it up. Frank Henenlotter's cult classic follows Dwayne Bradley, a quiet young man carrying a wicker basket through the city. But the real secret inside that basket is what turned the film into underground legend. Basket Case is cheap, rough, funny, grotesque, and strangely tragic all at once. Its power comes from the way it mixes outrageous monster movie shocks with the loneliness of outsiders living in a dirty, unforgiving city. The film's world feels sweaty and cramped, full of cheap hotel rooms, suspicious strangers, flickering lights, and the kind of street-level weirdness that mainstream horror usually tries to clean up. But Basket Case does not clean anything. It leans into the mess. That is why it became a midnight movie favorite. Viewers did not just remember the creature effects or the shocking premise. They remembered the mood, the ugliness, the strange sadness beneath the madness. On Tubi, it still feels dangerous in a way polished horror rarely does. It is not scary because it looks real. It is scary because it looks wrong. Basket Case is cult cinema at its most human and most deformed, ridiculous, disturbing, and weirdly unforgettable. Skinned Deep, 2004. Every cult list needs at least one movie that makes viewers ask, who thought of this and why did nobody stop them? Skinned Deep is that movie. This bizarre horror oddity from the early 2000s has built its reputation on being strange, uncomfortable, and almost impossible to categorize neatly. It throws a stranded family into a nightmare world filled with grotesque characters, warped humor, violent surprises, and the kind of low-budget imagination that feels both crude and strangely ambitious. One of the reasons people keep mentioning it is the presence of Warwick Davis, whose appearance adds an extra layer of cult curiosity to an already bizarre film. But Skinned Deep is not remembered because it behaves like normal horror. It is remembered because it does not. The movie feels like a collision between backwoods horror, freak show nightmare, dark comedy, and underground genre chaos. Its roughness becomes part of the experience, giving it the energy of something discovered rather than produced. That is exactly why it works in a Tubi cult movie lineup. It feels hidden, unpleasant, unpredictable, and oddly magnetic. Not every viewer will enjoy it, but almost nobody forgets it. Skinned Deep is the definition of a streaming rabbit hole movie, the kind you start out of curiosity and finish wondering what corner of cinema you just entered. Street Trash, 1987. Some cult movies feel dangerous because they break rules. Street Trash feels dangerous because it never believed rules existed. This is one of the most grotesque, chaotic, and aggressively strange films of the 80s exploitation era, a movie that takes bad taste and turns it into a full visual assault. The story revolves around a toxic bottle of cheap liquor called Viper, sold to homeless men in New York, with horrifying results. But Street Trash is not just remembered for its shocking premise. It is remembered for the way it transforms urban decay, body horror, dark comedy, and practical effects into something almost cartoonishly disturbing. The colors are bright, the violence is absurd, and the tone swings between disgusting, tragic, and weirdly comic without warning. That unpredictability is exactly why it became a midnight movie legend. It feels like a film made by people who wanted to test how much ugliness, humor, and surreal body-melting madness an audience could handle before looking away. Yet beneath all the slime and shock, there is also a grim portrait of a forgotten underclass being treated like disposable trash. That makes the movie more uncomfortable than simple splatter. On Tubi, Street Trash feels like something the algorithm should have buried in a locked cabinet, not placed within easy reach. It is filthy, loud, offensive in spirit, and visually unforgettable. This is not polite cult cinema. This is cinema with a dirty laugh, a melted face, and zero interest in being forgiven. Society, 1989. If wealth ever had a nightmare body, Society is what it would look like. Brian Yuzna's late 80s cult shocker begins like a paranoid rich kid thriller, with a young man slowly realizing that the elite world around him may not just be corrupt, but physically inhuman. That setup is already strong, but what pushed Society into cult immortality is the way it saves its most unforgettable horror for the final act. The film builds tension around class, privilege, family secrets, and the feeling that powerful people are not merely different from everyone else. They may literally feed on everyone else. Then it erupts into one of the most infamous practical effects sequences in cult horror history, a surreal body horror spectacle that viewers still talk about because it is disgusting, funny, political, and impossible to erase from memory. Society works because its metaphor is not subtle, and it does not need to be. It takes the fear of being consumed by the rich and turns it into flesh, noise, and nightmare imagery. That is why it still feels sharp decades later. In an era obsessed with inequality, the movie's grotesque class satire feels almost too modern. On Tubi, Society is the kind of film viewers click out of curiosity and finish with their eyebrows raised. It is elegant on the surface, rotten underneath, and completely unhinged when the mask finally comes off. Cult horror rarely gets this strange, this pointed, or this sticky. The Toxic Avenger, 1984. Only cult cinema could turn a mop-wielding monster into one of the strangest folk heroes of the VHS age. The Toxic Avenger is not clean, subtle, or respectable, and that is exactly why it became legendary. Born from Trauma Entertainment's proudly outrageous style, the film follows Melvin, a bullied janitor who is transformed by toxic waste into a mutated avenger of the abused, the ignored, and the powerless. On the surface, it is ridiculous. Exaggerated villains, cartoonish violence, strange humor, and a hero who looks like he walked out of a chemical nightmare. But underneath the mess is a surprisingly powerful cult formula. The movie gives revenge fantasy energy to every outsider who ever felt mocked, invisible, or pushed around. That emotional core is why it lasted beyond its shock value. Audiences did not just remember the slime and absurdity, they remembered the idea that the person everyone laughed at could become the one thing bullies feared. The film's low-budget roughness became part of its charm, helping build Trauma into a symbol of independent genre rebellion. On Tubi, The Toxic Avenger still feels like a radioactive middle finger to polished studio entertainment. It is gross, funny, wild, and strangely sincere in its own distorted way. This is not just a cult movie, it is a declaration that weird cinema does not need permission to survive. Sometimes all it needs is toxic waste, a broken world, and one unforgettable monster with a moral code. Eraserhead, 1977. At the top of the list is not the loudest cult movie, but the one that feels like it escaped from someone's deepest anxiety. Eraserhead is David Lynch's black and white industrial nightmare, a film so strange and unsettling that explaining its plot almost weakens the experience. It follows Henry Spencer through a world of hissing machines, empty rooms, nervous silence, disturbing domestic fear, and imagery that feels half dream, half punishment. Unlike many cult films built on gore, comedy, or outrageous spectacle, Eraserhead works through atmosphere. It traps the viewer inside a mood. The sound design alone feels alive, like the walls are breathing and the city is quietly rotting around the characters. Its story touches on parenthood, guilt, isolation, sexual anxiety, and the terror of responsibility, but it never explains itself in a neat way. That is why it became one of the most important midnight movies ever made. Viewers did not simply watch it, they argued about it, feared it, returned to it, and carried its images around like bad dreams. On Tubi, finding Eraserhead among chaotic cult titles feels almost surreal, because this is not just weird for fun, it is weird with purpose. It proved that a low-budget film could become a cinematic myth by refusing to comfort the audience. Eraserhead is the perfect number one because it represents the deepest level of cult cinema. Not a movie you merely enjoy, but one that changes the temperature of the room after it ends. Somewhere inside Tubi, hidden between forgotten uploads and dusty recommendations, are sci-fi stories that predicted fears we are still living with today. Which one shocked you the most? And what hidden masterpiece did we miss? Drop your picks in the comments. If you love buried classics, lost cult films, and sci-fi that feels dangerous, hit like, subscribe, and stay close. Because the next list gets even stranger.